You're looking at a reconstruction. You've seen this image before, in a documentary, in a coffee table book on biblical history, on a church wall, on the screen during a Sunday school lesson you half remember. Solomon's Temple. The golden pillars at the entrance, Yakin and Boaz, two massive bronze columns with ornate capitals. The immense bronze basin called the sea, resting on the backs of 12 cast bronze oxen, 3 facing each cardinal direction. The cedar-paneled walls, the incense rising from the altar, and then behind the great curtain, the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, 20 cubits square, 20 cubits high. Inside the Holy of Holies, 2 cherubim, each one 15 feet tall, wings spread wide. The reconstruction is stunning. Someone with architectural software has filled in all the details that 41 verses of the Bible left to the imagination. You look at the caption at the bottom of the image. Reconstruction based on 1 Kings chapters 6 and 7 and 2 Chronicles chapters 3 and 4. You flip to those chapters. 41 verses. You start reading. The measurements, the cedar, the gold overlay, the olive wood doors, the chains of gold. You get to the cherubim. 1 Kings chapter 6. Each cherub has a wingspan of 10 cubits. The room is 20 cubits wide. One wing touches the south wall, one wing touches the north wall, the other wings meet in the middle. 10 cubits plus 10 cubits. The wings cover the entire room from wall to wall. Now add the Ark of the Covenant. The text says it was placed under the wings. And once a year, the high priest walked through the curtain, alone. You try to picture where he stood. There is no space in the description for him to stand. And you are reading this for the first time in your life, looking at a 3-dimensional model, built from a text that contains a geometry that doesn't fit. The caption said, reconstruction. You hadn't noticed until right now what that word meant. There is something I need to be direct about. Solomon's Temple is the most painted, most reconstructed, most described religious building in Western history. Every major museum with an ancient Near East wing has a model of it. Every documentary about the Bible includes a visualization. Every study Bible has a floor plan. Christian schools teach its dimensions. Jewish tradition considers its memory sacred. The entire second half of the book of Exodus, chapters 25 through 40, provides the measurements of the tabernacle that preceded it as a kind of architectural foreshadowing. And not one brick of Solomon's Temple has ever been verified by an archaeologist. Not one. I don't mean the evidence is sparse. I don't mean it's contested or debated or awaiting further excavation. I mean that Kathleen Kenyon, one of the most respected biblical archaeologists of the 20th century, the woman who excavated Jericho, the woman whose stratigraphic methods defined modern Near Eastern archaeology, stated for the record that there is, quote, no archaeological evidence for the existence of Solomon's Temple. The site where it stood, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, has not been excavated by archaeologists. Not in the 19th century, not in the 20th century, not in the 21st century. Not because the technology doesn't exist, not because scholars lack interest. Because the site is controlled by the Islamic Waqf, the Islamic Religious Trust, under a political agreement between Israel and Jordan that has been in place since 1967. Excavation is prohibited. Surface examination is restricted. The ground beneath the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque has not been touched by a single archaeological instrument in 150 years. The last systematic examination of the Temple Mount was conducted by Charles Warren between 1867 and 1870. He found nothing identifiable as Solomon's Temple. The most important religious site in Christianity and Judaism cannot be examined. Not because of time, not because of destruction, because of a political agreement made in living memory. The building at the center of 3,000 years of faith is hidden not by ancient powers. It is hidden by a decision made in 1967 that is being enforced today, right now, by armed guards and international political convention. My name is Nathan, 12 years of world history at a Catholic school in Evansville, resigned when the questions I was finding in the sources stopped matching what I was allowed to teach. This channel is what I do with that. I've spent the last several months on a question that I thought would take 2 weeks. The question started simply, what do we actually know about Solomon's Temple? Not what the tradition says, Not what the reconstructions show, not what Josephus described in the 1st century, working from sources we no longer have. What has been physically verified? The answer stopped me. I want to share what I found. Because it isn't just that the evidence is thin, it's that the evidence that does exist, or rather, the evidence that almost didn't survive, tells a story about the temple that is considerably stranger than anything the reconstructions show. There are 4 threads I'm going to follow. The archaeology, what was examined, what was destroyed, and what Barkay called the greatest archaeological disaster to befall Jerusalem. The historical question, when the temple was actually built and by whom. The text itself, those 41 verses and the geometry that doesn't work. And the Ark, the holiest object in the Torah, which vanishes from the biblical record 37 years before the Babylonians even arrive, with no explanation given. Then I want to show you what J.J. Benítez concluded after 40 years of investigation into what the temple was actually built to do. Let's start in a parking lot in Jerusalem. I was assigned to cover the Temple Mount Sifting project as a features piece. My editor described it as a quiet story. Volunteers sifting soil, probably good for a photo essay. Nothing controversial. I flew into Ben Gurion in the morning, drove to Jerusalem, and found the project in a converted parking lot in the Tzurim Valley, on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. What I expected, a handful of scholars in a quiet academic setting. What I found, 200 volunteers from 40 countries, standing at long tables covered in wire mesh frames, pouring bucket after bucket of soil through the mesh, examining what caught on the screen, dropping it into collection bins, reaching for the next bucket. The man running it was Gabriel Barkay, 70-something, field clothes, the kind of tan you get from 30 years of actual excavation, not conference presentations. He was moving along the tables, stopping to examine what individual volunteers had found, occasionally crouching to look more closely at something in a collection bin. He saw me arrive with a press badge and came over. I shook his hand and told him what I was doing. He didn't say anything. He reached into a collection bin nearby and picked something up, a small clay disc, about the size of a thumbnail, slightly convex with writing pressed into it. He handed it to me. 3 weeks ago, he said, this was in a garbage dump. I turned it over in my hand. The writing was ancient Hebrew. What is it? A bulla, he said. A clay seal impression. This one is from the First Temple period. He pointed to the writing. This priestly family name appears in the book of Jeremiah. This is a real object from the period when the temple existed. It came from the Temple Mount. I asked the obvious question, how did it end up in a garbage dump? Barkay looked at me for a moment. Then he turned and pointed toward the city wall. Above the wall, the gold dome of the Rock. Behind it, the silver of Al-Aqsa. In 1999, he said, the Islamic Religious Trust, the Waqf, conducted unauthorized construction work on the Temple Mount. They used heavy machinery to excavate the southeastern corner. No archaeological permits, no archaeological supervision. They removed approximately 300 truckloads of soil. He paused. That soil contained up to 3,000 years of unexcavated archaeological deposits. They dumped it in the Kidron Valley, mixed with modern trash. I looked at the bulla in my hand. This came from that dump? We've been sifting through the Kidron Valley dump since 2005, he said. We found more than 400,000 artifacts. First Temple period pottery, stone weights. This, he nodded at the bulla. The soil that produced these artifacts came from the most archaeologically rich ground in Jerusalem. I asked the question that had been forming since he pointed toward the dome. Where is the rest of it? He looked at the Temple Mount for a long moment. There, under a mosque, we're not allowed to look. That sentence, we're not allowed to look, became the frame for everything I found afterward. The Waqf never obtained the required permits for that construction project. They used heavy equipment and removed approximately 300 truckloads of soil, containing up to 3,000 years of unexcavated deposits, dumped in the Kidron Valley with modern trash. The Israel Antiquities Authority protested. UNESCO was engaged. The construction continued. Barkay established the Temple Mount Sifting Project in 2005. By 2020, 400,000 artifacts recovered by hand from that dump. First, temple period pottery, stone weights, the bulla, fragments of decorated stone tile that may be from the temple itself, all of it pulled from garbage. The structures those artifacts came from, still inaccessible, still unexcavated, still under the dome of the rock. The question isn't whether evidence existed. The question is what happened to it. Have you ever wondered why none of the reconstructions ever came with a disclaimer? You've seen the temple rebuilt 100 times. Illustrated Bibles, museum dioramas, Hollywood productions. Detailed architectural models that scholars walk you through with laser pointers and reverence. You were never told you were looking at a hypothesis. You were never told the three-dimensional model was extrapolated from 41 verses. You were never told that the ground where the temple stood cannot be examined, cannot be excavated, because right now today it is controlled by an agreement that prohibits exactly the kind of investigation that would settle 3,000 years of argument. The decision to keep it that way is not ancient. It was made 60 years ago. It is being enforced this morning. There is a second problem with Solomon's temple, and it comes from Israeli academia. Israel Finkelstein at Tel Aviv University and Neil Asher Silberman, The Bible Unearthed 2001, are not fringe voices. Finkelstein was director of the Institute of Archaeology at Tel Aviv. This is taught at Israeli universities. Their argument, the Jerusalem of Solomon's era was not capable of producing what 1 Kings describes. 180,000 conscripted workers, 7 years of construction, 1,400 chariots, 12 administrative districts, international trade with Tyre and Egypt. Jerusalem in 950 BCE was a small hill country settlement with a population of perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 people. The infrastructure described in 1 Kings doesn't fit the period. It fits, archaeologically, the 7th century, 300 years later. King Josiah, not Solomon. I want to be careful here. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the Temple Mount has not been excavated. But this is the honest position. We cannot confirm the temple archaeologically, and the question of when it was built is genuinely contested among serious scholars. The Sunday school lesson assumed the question was settled. It isn't. Let me return to those 41 verses. Because even if we accept the tradition exactly as written, Solomon built the temple, it housed the ark, it stood for 4 centuries. The text itself contains a problem that nobody in the teaching I received ever flagged. 1 Kings chapter 6 describes the interior of the temple in detail. The Holy of Holies, 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 20 cubits high. A cubic chamber of perfect proportions. Inside the Holy of Holies, 2 cherubim of olive wood, each overlaid in gold. Each cherub had a wingspan of 10 cubits. One wing of each cherub touched a wall. The other wing of each cherub touched the wing of the other cherub, meeting in the center of the room. 10 cubits plus 10 cubits. The total wingspan exactly equals the room's width. The cherubim's wings covered the entire room from wall to wall. Under the wings, the Ark of the Covenant. And once a year on Yom Kippur, the high priest entered the Holy of Holies alone. He carried incense. He sprinkled blood on the mercy seat. The Talmudic tradition describes the procedure in detail. The high priest wore bells on his robe so those outside could hear him moving. A rope was tied to his ankle so that if he collapsed inside, his body could be retrieved without anyone else having to enter, because whatever was in that room could kill him if the ritual was not performed exactly correctly. Now, where did he stand? The room is 20 cubits wide, 2 cherubim, each with a 10-cubit wingspan, wings touching the walls on both sides, wings touching each other in the center. The ark under the wings. I have spent more time than I want to admit trying to solve this geometry. It does not resolve. Either the high priest squeezed into a space the text does not describe, between the cherub's body and the wall, in some unspecified corner the architectural description leaves out, or the text is not giving us the kind of literal floor plan the reconstructions assume. There is a third possibility. The room wasn't designed to be comfortable. It was designed to be precise. I want to tell you about the moment that genuinely stopped me in this investigation. Not the Waqf bulldoze, not Finkelstein, not the cherubim paradox, the ark. The Ark of the Covenant is one of the most frequently mentioned objects in the entire Hebrew Bible. Exodus describes its construction in exact detail. 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, 1.5 cubits high, overlaid inside and outside with pure gold, with a mercy seat on top flanked by 2 golden cherubim, with poles of acacia wood run through golden rings on its sides, so it could be carried without being touched. It was carried through the wilderness. It opened the Jordan River. It brought down the walls of Jericho. It killed Uzzah when he reached out to steady it. 2 Samuel chapter 6 verse 6 states plainly that God struck him dead for touching it. It filled the temple with the visible glory of God at the dedication in 1 Kings chapter 8 verses 10 through 11. The text is unambiguous about what the ark was and what it could do. And then it disappears. Not destroyed, not taken, not hidden. It disappears from the biblical record. The last time the Ark of the Covenant is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as a physically present object is in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, verse 3, around 623 BCE. King Josiah addresses the Levites and tells them to put the Holy Ark in the house. That is the last mention. 37 years later, the Babylonians besieged Jerusalem. They breached the walls. They entered the temple. And in 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 13 through 17, you can read the Babylonian inventory. They are meticulous. Bronze pillars listed by circumference and height. The bronze sea listed by weight. The stands, the pots, the shovels, the snuffers, the bowls of gold, the bowls of silver. Every object is accounted for. The ark is not in the list, not destroyed, not taken, not hidden, not listed. I spent a week looking for scholarly explanations for why the ark doesn't appear in the Babylonian inventory. The best answer I found was, we don't know. The text doesn't say. The holiest object in the Torah, the object the temple was built to house, the object that the high priest entered alone once a year to approach, vanished from the written record before the Babylonians arrived, and the Bible offers no explanation. There are theories. I want to give them to you without embellishing the evidence. 2nd Maccabees, written in the 2nd century BCE, records that the prophet Jeremiah hid the ark before the Babylonian conquest, sealing it in a cave on Mount Nebo in what is now Jordan. The location, Jeremiah said, would remain unknown until God gathered his people again. It is old, it is specific, it cannot be verified. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church holds that the ark is in Axum, in the treasury of the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, guarded by a single monk appointed for life, never permitted to leave, who speaks to no one about what he has seen. Scholars have not been permitted to examine the object. And then there is the third possibility, the one Benítez came back to after 40 years. Josephus mentions that Solomon built underground vaults beneath the temple. The Talmudic tractate Yoma describes a chamber beneath the Holy of Holies for concealment. The ark hidden directly beneath where it had rested, still under the Temple Mount, still under the agreement signed in 1967. Benítez did not claim the ark was in any of these locations. His conclusion was more precise. The trail ends before the Babylonians arrived, and the location where the question could be answered is the one place in the world where the answer is actively prevented from being sought. You know what I find strangest about all of this? The Babylonians were meticulous administrators. They catalogued their looting by circumference, weight, and count. They didn't miss the ark. They didn't skip it. It wasn't there. Which means something happened to the holiest object in Judaism in the 37 years between Josiah's last mention of it and the Babylonian siege. And not a single biblical author thought it worth recording what that was. Either the information was lost, or it was protected. Let me tell you what Benítez concluded about what the temple was actually built for, because this is the part that stayed with me longest. In his investigation, Benítez catalogued the physical events described around the ark. 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 6. Uzzah touched the ark to steady it and died immediately. 1 Samuel chapter 5. The ark in Philistine territory caused mass illness in Ashdod, then Gath, then Ekron. Wherever it was moved, the city sickened. 1 Samuel chapter 6 verse 19. 70 men of Beth-shemesh were struck dead for looking into it. 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 10 through 11. The dedication of the temple was interrupted by a cloud of such density and brightness that the priests could not stand to minister. The text presents these as physical events, not metaphors. The rope on the high priest's ankle was not ceremonial. It was a practical provision for the possibility that a man could die inside that room and that no one else could go in after him. Benítez's conclusion: the temple was not designed as a house of communal worship. It was designed as a containment structure. The concentric zones, outer courts, inner courts, sanctuary, Holy of Holies, were not stages of increasing reverence. They were stages of increasing proximity to something that required controlled conditions, precise protocols, and extreme caution to approach safely. The building was built around the object, not the other way around. 40 years of investigation brought Benítez to the same conclusion the text supports when you read it without the overlay of tradition. The holiest object in Judaism and Christianity was not primarily symbolic. It was operational. And whatever it did, it required a structure specifically designed to contain it. Think about what you were taught, not what you were told explicitly. What you absorbed. You absorbed the image of the temple as a house of prayer, a sacred space, a place where people gathered to worship. You saw the golden pillars at the entrance, the incense, the worshippers in the outer courts. You were given a picture of communal devotion, of beauty, of the covenant made visible in stone and cedar and gold. Nobody gave you the rope. Nobody explained that the high priest entered alone once a year with a rope tied to his ankle into a room that the text describes as killing people who touched it incorrectly or looked at it incorrectly or were in its presence incorrectly. Nobody asked you to reconcile the devotional image, the building as a place of prayer, with what the text says happened inside. The tradition handed you a metaphor and left the physics out. I want to tell you about the afternoon I stood on the Temple Mount. 3 weeks after the parking lot with Barkay, I obtained a visitor's permit. Not as a journalist, as a tourist. Non-Muslim visitors are permitted on the Temple Mount during restricted hours through the Mughrabi Gate. You are escorted. You cannot stop for extended periods. You cannot kneel. You cannot pray. You cannot examine anything below surface level. You are watched. I walked through the gate on a Tuesday morning with a tour group of 8 and a WAF escort. The platform is enormous. 7.5 acres of stone paving. The dome of the rock at the center, brilliant gold in the morning light. I stood at the base of the staircase that leads to the raised platform, where the temple traditionally stood for perhaps 2 minutes. The stone under my feet was Ottoman. Below that Crusader, below that Byzantine, below that Herodian, below that of something earlier. The escort was watching me. I thought about 300 truckloads. I thought about the cherubim and the geometry that doesn't work. I thought about the ark that isn't in the Babylonian inventory. I left. You can visit the Temple Mount today, right now. You can book the tour, you can fly to Tel Aviv, take the bus to Jerusalem, walk through the old city, find the Mughrabi Gate. You can stand where Solomon's temple is supposed to have stood. You cannot dig. You cannot look below the surface. You cannot take a soil sample. The prohibition is not 3,000 years old. It is not ancient history protecting a holy site from sacrilege. It is a political agreement negotiated between the governments of Israel and Jordan in 1967. It is administered by an Islamic religious council. It is enforced by armed security and international convention. The question of whether Solomon's temple existed, where it stood when it was built, who built it, what it contained, what happened to the object at its center, cannot be answered because the answer is being actively blocked, not by ignorance, not by time, by a decision made in living memory. 3 months after my first visit to the sifting project, I went back. Barkay was at the tables, same field clothes, same way of moving along the mesh frames, crouching, examining, standing up. I told him I'd been on the Temple Mount since we last spoke. He nodded, not surprised. I asked him the question I'd been holding since the parking lot. Do you think it's there? He straightened up and looked toward the Temple Mount. The dome was visible above the wall, gold against the blue morning sky. He was quiet for a long time. I think, he said, that there is something there that hasn't been allowed to be discovered yet. Not confirmation, not dismissal, not the careful academic hedge, something that wasn't quite either. I've been thinking about that sentence for 3 months. The archaeologist is still there, every working day, sifting by hand through what someone tried to throw away. 70% done. The other 30% still in the Kidron Valley dump, mixed with modern trash, waiting. And below the gold dome, below the stone platform, below the Ottoman and Crusader and Byzantine and Herodian layers, in the ground that no one is allowed to examine, whatever answer exists to 3,000 years of theological certainty, still there, still waiting. And below the Kidron Valley dump, below the garbage bags and the construction debris, below what someone tried to throw away, 400,000 artifacts and counting, being recovered by hand, one bucket at a time. The question of what Solomon's temple actually was, who built it, what it contained, what became of the object at its center, remains open. Not because of time, not because of ignorance, because of a decision made in living memory and being enforced this morning. That's where the investigation ends, not with an answer. With a man in a parking lot in Jerusalem holding a clay seal from a garbage dump, pointing at a gold dome, and saying, "We're not allowed to look. You decide what to do with this."